Hello, and thank you for this opportunity to talk to you today about sustainability in agriculture. My name is Rowan Nelson, and I'm an agricultural and natural resource economist with ABARES. Now, ABARES is the Australian Bureau of Agricultural and Resource Economics and Sciences, and we're a research division inside the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. Today I'll briefly review the attributes of agricultural sustainability that make it such a challenging policy issue. And I'll also run through some frameworks that give us some pragmatic ways forward to balance our thinking about development in economic terms and in ecological terms. These frameworks highlight the foundational role that agriculture plays in sustainable economic and ecological development, and we can see this unfolding in Australia and Vietnam, and I'll use Australia and Vietnam today as examples. I'll finish by reviewing the policy strategies that Australia uses to ensure that development is both economically and ecologically sustainable. One of the reasons why sustainability in agriculture is such a challenging policy topic is because it often involves conflicting goals for the environment and for economic development. Sustainability in agriculture tends to be especially challenging when it's driven by a focus on the loss of iconic natural ecosystems or species. One type of development that attracts particular attention and tends to dominate is the conversion of tropical rainforests into agricultural land. And that tends to dominate because of the high species diversity of those tropical rainforests. But it's more than that. It's also because the types of farming systems that tend to be established once tropical forests are cleared, they tend to themselves not to be terribly sustainable with rapidly declining soil fertility. And persisting with agriculture in those environments tends to lead to other problems like erosion and poor water quality, which then has knock-on effects deleterious to communities downstream. But agricultural sustainability is so much more complex than this. Even in these kinds of environments, sustainable agriculture has been proven to be possible. This is an example of the Banawe rice terraces in the Philippines, which have been in operation for many hundreds of years. But just in general, we have to think more broadly than the replacement of tropical rainforests by agriculture. There are lots of places around the world where conversion of land from its original ecosystem to agriculture has already taken place. And in many cases, less iconic ecosystems have been replaced by very productive and highly sustainable forms of agriculture. Sustainability is also a challenging policy topic because of the need to feed a growing world population. Governments have to balance goals for development with goals for the environment because of the fact that sustainability is also about the sustainability of human populations as much as it is about the sustainability of the environment, and the two really are inseparable. Now, governments wanting to reconcile these conflicting goals face some immediate implementation challenges. And the first is that sustainability cannot be directly measured. This makes it very difficult to set goals, to develop strategies, and to monitor progress. Sustainability is just one of a number of descriptors for human and natural systems that have this problem. They're conceptually tangible, but in practice only measurable through indirect proxies. And that's where conceptual frameworks are very helpful because they can help us organise and apply these proxies in ways that are repeatable and in ways that can support policy development, monitoring and evaluation. Another challenge is that sustainability at one scale cannot necessarily be understood by looking at sustainability at other scales. So activities that have small impacts on individual farms, for example, may have very significant cumulative effects at a catchment or a landscape scale. Examples include erosion and chemical leaching, which may be barely noticeable on farm, but may, in a cumulative sense, reduce water quality, clog waterways with sediment, and affect the health of reefs and fisheries downstream. And vice versa, the sustainability of farms and even industries may not affect the sustainability of food systems terribly much if there are readily available substitutes that are perhaps even more productive. Governments also face the risk of not choosing appropriate governance models. At one extreme, it is tempting for governments to pursue sustainability using top-down or command and control approaches to policy. Now, these approaches often flow from a perception that local communities lack the knowledge or the skills, resources, etc. to manage natural systems effectively. Experts are brought in to produce environmental plans, and these may or may not reflect local knowledge and then have actions that are imposed on the communities involved with varying amounts of consultation. Now, these top-down approaches to sustainability have tended to be ineffective in the past and can have some quite bad adverse consequences. They can fail to recognise the role that local communities play in managing natural resources, particularly the communities that live and work every day in those environments and every day interacting and actually managing those natural resources, when the governments and the government agencies might be quite remote from those processes. An example across Southeast Asia has been the designation of steep or forested land as publicly owned. This has effectively turned these areas into common property resources and greatly reduced the incentives that local populations have to pursue sustainability. Top-down approaches to management also tend to be inflexible. Expert environmental planning is expensive and difficult to update, so it tends not to be updated. And by not including local knowledge, it tend to not capture the richness of policy settings that are needed to manage all the diverse operating contexts. And at the end of the day, simply taking a one-size-fits-all approach means that if the policy is inappropriate, it tends to fail on a grand scale. Now, ecological sustainable development has evolved as a pragmatic framework for reconciling these two conflicting approaches to development, the economic and the ecological. It emphasises that different policies, strategies are needed for the ecological and the economic, and that these strategies are complementary rather than conflicting. This diagram ranks potential development in terms of its impact and reversibility. So for iconic and irreplaceable natural environments, development may do irreversible harm and may need to be strictly regulated or even banned. But for often a much greater scope of development, environmental impacts may be either low or easily reversible. And this type of development can be reviewed as the recombination and transformation of capitals from one form to another. Ecological sustainable development also complements more collaborative approaches to governance. And these seek to match roles and responsibilities with the tier of governance that has the most appropriate capability and knowledge to meet those responsibilities. Collaborative governance goes way beyond simple devolution of responsibility from tiers that are higher in the hierarchy to tiers that are lower. In collaborative and adaptive forms of governance, the tiers support each other, their roles are complementary. So for example, national governments often take the lead in coordinating across tiers. They provide funding and establish good governance that allows the other tiers to work effectively. And they also support basic knowledge creation through national innovation systems. State and regional governments tend to lead implementation. They're closer to communities. They develop lots of applied knowledge and synthesize that with insights from local communities so that policy can target local operating contexts. And by tailoring programs in that way, they enable the efforts of local communities. Communities and households themselves provide all sorts of local insights that are not obvious at higher tiers of government and in formal innovation systems and education systems. And they also provide the resources, knowledge and social networks for getting things done on the ground and for modifying daily practice to meet sustainability goals. We can use these principles to create a balanced approach to sustainability policy in agriculture. For the majority of development activities that are either of low impact or are readily reversible, we can think of development as the process of combining and transforming different types of capital to create wealth and social well-being. Primary industries such as agriculture, fisheries, forestry and mining play a crucial role in combining natural capital with social and human capital to create physical and financial capital. And development is sustainable if the overall capital stock increases through reinvestment. Of course, steps need to be taken to ensure that this development is ecologically sustainable through regulatory measures that protect iconic and irreplaceable natural environments. Through social and political processes, some types of development are judged too harmful or insufficiently reversible to proceed. These are then banned or regulated to reduce their impact. And this needs to be supported by efforts to monitor the health of natural capital and find a way of reflecting changes in the stocks of natural capital in our national accounting systems. Development becomes unsustainable if capital is not reinvested and the overall stock of capital starts to fall. Now, a range of institutional processes can prevent the transformation and reinvestment of capital. Importantly, this includes over-regulation of forms of development that can be sustainable. Regulating or banning agriculture is usually helpful for activities that threaten significant irreversible damage to iconic natural ecosystems. This is because the goal here is to protect these assets for current and future generations. Regulation for most other types of development needs to be carefully considered, and this is because it can impede development by preventing resources from flowing to their highest value uses. Now, we can see this capital substitution process driving development in Australia and Vietnam by looking at the productivity of labour in different sectors of the economy. And this highlights the foundational role that agriculture plays in economic development and food security. And in this section, I will be talking about economic development before in the next section talking about what we also need to do to make sure that development is ecologically sustainable. At early stages of development, the productivity of labour grows faster in agriculture than it does in the manufacturing or services sector. This is due to the increasing use of machinery and fertilisers and also other advances in technology such as plant breeding. Productivity is lower in these other sectors because labour is less easily replaced by machinery and other technologies. Now, development tends to proceed with labour flowing firstly from agriculture into the manufacturing sector and later into services, where more of it is needed. This is because as incomes grow, the demand for food reaches natural limits and households demand more manufactured goods and services. Agricultural production continues to grow, but agriculture's share of GDP falls as the manufacturing and services sectors grow. The productivity growth of labour in Australia has been more consistent and higher in agriculture than it has been in other sectors. The growth of productivity in mining can be high at times, but varies wildly with boom and bust cycles. And the growth of labour productivity in manufacturing has actually been falling in recent years. Productivity growth in Australian agriculture has released labour to other sectors, contributing to economic growth. The number of people employed in Australian agriculture has not changed much since 1911, more than 100 years. But since then, the rest of the workforce has expanded enormously, such that agriculture's share of employment has fallen to around 2.5%. Now, the transformation and reinvestment of capital that these data reveal has more than doubled GDP growth in real terms over the last 50 years. Household expenditure on food has also fallen as food has become less expensive and as household incomes have risen. We can do a similar analysis for Vietnam, but we need to keep in mind that the two countries are on very different trajectories of development. This is at least partly due to different endowments of land and labour, and there are also factors that can reduce the rate at which labour is absorbed into other sectors from agriculture. Now, the productivity of labour in Vietnam, in Vietnam's agricultural sector, has been growing steadily, but it remains similar to productivity in sectors such as mining and manufacturing. And it's also been growing more slowly than the productivity of labour in the services sector, especially the financial services component of the services sector. Now, despite this, agriculture's share of total employment in Vietnam has fallen from over 70% in the 1990s to less than 40% today. The Vietnamese economy appears to be at a point of transition from an agriculture-based society to a much more industrialised economy. Now, experts in the IMF and elsewhere attribute Vietnam's rapid economic development to the rate at which labour is flowing to higher value uses in manufacturing and the services sector. GDP per person has nearly tripled in real terms since the 1980s, with agriculture falling from over 40% of GDP to around 15% today. But while incomes have been rising, they're still at a low level, and food is still a very significant share of household expenditure. So what we've just been talking about are some of the economic measures of economic development, but we need to ask ourselves, is that economic development ecologically sustainable? Now, Australia combines a range of policy strategies for helping to ensure that economic development is in fact ecologically sustainable, and I'd like to take you through some of those now. And the first of these is actually monitoring and measuring natural capital. The problem with the analysis I just showed you is that economic measures of development poorly reflect the health of the underlying natural resource base. The ongoing growth of agricultural productivity in Australia's agricultural sector might suggest that development is sustainable, or it could reveal a rundown in natural resources that is likely to limit future development. Of particular concern here is the resilient nature of ecological systems. The ecological systems that support agriculture, fisheries and forestry may continue to do so under the pressure of development for quite some period of time until critical thresholds are reached. And when these tipping points are reached, changes can be sudden and dramatic. And an example is when fish stocks collapse as a result of falling below a minimum viable population. One way of at least recognising this issue and embedding it in national thinking about economic development is to try and capture natural capital in national accounting processes. Now, Australia has taken a leading role internationally in the development of the international system of environmental economic accounting. Australia's own environmental accounts currently include the value of timber, energy, mineral and land assets, and research is going on to extend this to other things like water, which can also have a monetary value attached. But a long-term objective is to extend national accounting to the services provided by ecosystems and recognising that economic value of ecosystem function. So in the meantime, as these things are not measurable and not directly comparable to some of the economic values, Australia has a range of other strategies for ensuring that development is ecologically sustainable. And one of the main strategies is having a national reserve system. As at the 30th of June 2020, Australia's national reserve system included over 13,000 protected areas, covering nearly 20% of the country, which is around 150 million hectares. This includes land protected by national and state governments, Indigenous lands, and areas protected by farmers and not-for-profit conservation organisations. Australia also has a system of regional forest agreements that govern the productive and conservation use of Australia's native forests. These seek to balance the certainty of timber supply for industry with the flow of ecological services for current and future generations. Now, development outside the reserve system is regulated under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act. Under this Act, new development that might impact nationally significant animals, plants, habitats and places is all subject to an environmental assessment and approval process. And most of these proposed developments are also subject to a range of state, territory and local government laws. Environmental regulation is also part of the system of regulation governing existing agricultural land use and farm management practices. These include regulations on water use, the control of weeds, pests and diseases, and the use of chemicals and genetically modified organisms. Ecological sustainable development in Australia has also been supported by a comprehensive program of market reform. Market reform, including trade liberalisation, facilitates sustainable development by allowing resources to flow to their highest value uses. Prior to the 1990s, Australia had a highly regulated agricultural sector. Statutory marketing boards were established to try to increase the returns, the incomes of small farms, and most of these were established initially in the 1920s and 30s when agricultural prices were particularly low. But since then, and through into the 1980s, the number of these marketing boards increased every time agricultural prices were low, and by the 1980s we had nearly 70 of these organisations. Market regulation, both in Australia and globally through restricted trade, crippled the growth of the Australian agricultural sector following World War II. It did this by allocating resources to their least efficient uses, to industries in which Australia had no particular competitive advantage, but which were used to meet other objectives. Price averaging and support undermined farmers' incentives for innovation, as well as their incentives to self-manage their own risk and to seek higher value markets. And regulation within the administrative bodies charged with marketing themselves removed any sense of commercial imperative, removed competition, enabled marketing and administration costs to be inflated and socialised, and reduced incentives for innovation. Now, most of Australia's statutory marketing boards were dismantled in the 1990s and early 2000s, and this was part of economy-wide microeconomic reform and indeed global microeconomic reform. And it included a consolidated national approach to competition policy. Deregulation was primarily motivated by the need for Australia to be competitive in world markets, and also because of the obvious effects that regulation was having on development and household incomes. Now, market reform in agriculture has contributed to productivity growth by reallocating resources from small, inefficient farms to much larger and much more efficient farms. This consolidation of farms has tended to happen gradually. It's generational change over decades as farmers retire and sell to their neighbours. In industries where structural adjustment has been more rapid than this and led to some potential social disruption, a range of government programs have helped farmers transition to other livelihoods. Now, the misallocation of resources due to market regulation is estimated to have reduced productivity in Australian agriculture by around 4% per year in the 1970s and 80s. And the reallocation of resources following market reform accounted for over a third of productivity growth in the 1990s and 2/3 in the 2000s. So today, Australia, along with Vietnam, is now one of the least protected agricultural economies in the world, with producer support less than 2% of gross farm revenue. The result has been that Australian agriculture is now much more efficient and internationally competitive than it was prior to market reform. Market reform contributed to a doubling of growth in agricultural output after 1990, even with a series of severe droughts in the 2000s. Now, the Australian government also ensures that development is ecologically sustainable by making sure that it is socially sustainable, using a range of collaborative and adaptive approaches to governance that recognise and support the role of local communities in the day-to-day management of natural resources. Australia has a long history of farmers and conservationists working together to ensure that agriculture is sustainably developed. And over the last 3 decades, this has become collectively known as Landcare, a large community-based movement of people concerned about the environment and conservation in farming. There are now over 6,000 community groups and hundreds of thousands of volunteers around Australia regularly engage in sustainable agricultural and conservation-related activities. These community groups are part of a coordinated system across all tiers of government. This coordination helps to ensure that cohesion between the activities of community groups and making sure they make sense at the landscape and catchment scales. This has been supported by the Australian government since the early 1990s through a series of programs, often known as the National Landcare Program. This community approach to natural resource management in agriculture enables the Australian government to pursue sustainable development, even in regions where the reach of government agencies is less due to distance and other factors. The priorities of the current program include the loss of vegetation, soil degradation, protections against the introduction of pests, pest weeds and animals, changes in water quality, a high priority, as well as changes in Australia's fire regimes. Now, a feature of Australia's approach to community-based natural resource management has been the creation of over 50 regional bodies to coordinate catchment and landscape scale activities. Now, this is a mix of government and non-government organisations, and they all work together to coordinate efforts of community groups at those higher scales. And this is to address big landscape issues like weeds, erosion, and salinity. Revegetation is one of the most common activities undertaken by local communities in both rural and urban areas, and in agricultural areas. Conservation groups and farmers often get together to implement much larger scale activities to address issues such as salinity and erosion. So in summary, ecologically sustainable development provides a pragmatic framework for addressing the issues that make sustainability such a challenging policy topic. And the Australian government uses it to balance economic development with ecological sustainability in agriculture. A key learning from this has been that government intervention is most helpful for protecting Australia's iconic and irreplaceable natural environments. But in areas where development can be sustainable, deregulation has allowed resources to flow to their highest value uses. Australia's approach also recognises and embraces the role that local communities play in ecologically sustainable development. This extends government efforts far beyond the reach of what central agencies could achieve on their own. Thank you.